Hello, everyone. My name is Lampros Stujanos. I'm a partner at Miller Thomson, as the computer just said. We're a proud sponsor. We're proud to sponsor this afternoon's breakout session on understanding operating risk, envisioning the future of P3 operations. For those of you who don't know Miller Thomson, we're about 550 lawyers located in 12 offices across the country, and we're an active participant in the P3 sector here in Canada. We advise both private and public sector clients on the structuring, procurement, financing, construction, and operation of facilities in a variety of sectors. On behalf of Miller Thomson, it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator of today's session, Louise Panneton, who is President and Managing Director at P1 Consulting. Louise has 30 years of hands-on experience in the infrastructure and facilities management sector. She has been a procurement lead, a fairness advisor, and run complex P3 outsourcing procurements, as well as been involved in operationalizing them. Her clients have included Infrastructure Ontario, Defence Construction Canada, Library and Archives Canada, and several municipalities. In her work, she's gained considerable understanding of the different components of large, complex projects and the related governance models. So please join me in welcoming Louise and the panel. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm really excited to be here today to talk about operations. It is the best part of the P3 process, so we're going to focus on that today. So first I'll introduce the panel to you. I'm going to start with Shawn Wiley. Shawn is Executive Vice President, Asset and Contract Management for Infrastructure Ontario. Following the construction of P3 infrastructure projects, Shawn oversees the management of the long-term asset management contracts, along with the contract management of outsourced service providers for Infrastructure Ontario. Shawn and his team are also responsible for asset management of the entire portfolio, including capital planning, life cycle management, environmental and energy management services. Prior to joining Infrastructure Ontario, Shawn was the Vice President of Facilities and Project Management with SNC-Lavalin Operations and Maintenance. He has over 25 years of experience leading facilities management and project management service delivery for several large real estate portfolios in the telecom, financial, broadcasting, and public sectors. Shawn is a professional engineer and project management professional and volunteers with the City of Pickering as a member of its Committee of Adjustments and Waterfront Coordinating Committee. So welcome, Shawn, please. We'll move on to Paul. So he works with Plenary, who's an independent long-term investor, sponsor, and operator of public infrastructure in North America and the Asia-Pacific region. As co-head of Plenary's originating group from North America, Paul is responsible for structuring, bidding, and closing P3 projects in Canada and the US. Prior to joining Plenary, Paul was partner in a leading Bay Street law firm where he specialized in P3s and other structured finance transactions. As a lawyer, Paul represented lenders and project sponsors in a wide range of P3 projects in all asset classes. Paul is a graduate of the University of Auckland, the London School of Economics, and New York University School of Law, and a member of the Bar of the State of New York, as well as the Law Society of Ontario. Please welcome Paul. We move to Darrell Brown, who is a partner at Gowlings in their real estate and financial services group, working out of Gowlings WLG's Toronto office. His practice is concentrated in infrastructure, construction law, and real estate. Darrell's infrastructure law experience includes drafting and negotiating build finance, design build finance, operate, design build, and facilities management contracts on behalf of owners, developers, equity providers, contractors, and subcontractors. Darrell's recent experience includes acting for the successful service provider on the Howard County Courthouse, LAX Conrac, the Abbotsford Courthouse P3 projects, and acting on the successful O&M joint venture for Eglinton LRT, Finch LRT, the Gordie Howe Bridge P3 project, and acting for a consortium bid on Hurontario LRT projects. He's also acted on the successful consortium for the North Shore Wastewater Treatment and Conveyance Project, and is acting for the bidding consortium on the Lakeshore East-East and Lakeshore East-Central LRT projects. Darrell has also acted for a service provider on 32 successful P3 opportunities in the US and Canada, and acted on behalf of various clients on more than 100 P3 projects across Canada, the US, Chile, and Australia. Darrell is recognized in Chambers L Expert Canada, Who's Who, and Chambers Canada Best Lawyers in Canada. Please welcome Darrell. And we finish now with Claudio, who is currently Director of Business Development for Public-Private Partnership team with Johnson Control, serving the North American market. He has over 30 years experience with Johnson Control, working in a variety of leadership positions throughout North America. In his role, Claudio provides strategic leadership in the building efficiency business, providing solutions to clients that reduces their energy, their operations, and life cycle costs while creating a more sustainable workplace. He is responsible for maintaining relationships with key industry partners, market development, and negotiating the various projects and teaming agreements over the course of the development of a P3. He has successfully led the JCI business development team pursuing P3 projects from market sounding stage through to financial close. Claudio has participated on many projects working with design, construction, and financial team members to add a whole life perspective to the project design, which considers operations and energy in reducing costs and mitigating operational risks. There you go. Welcome to Claudio. So today we're really going to be focusing in on the operations phase, and in particular we're going to have a good discussion about risk and how risk is allocated and maintained through the P3 life cycle. So I'll moderate the session and call on the participants, and they'll add in as we go through. So the first thing I'd like to discuss is really who owns the risk. So when you look at owners, they really look at the project co-entity as a single point of accountability. And they're responsible to manage the risks on behalf of their team. Some of the projects have struggled a little bit in terms of that allocation of risk behind the curtain, if you'd like. So I'd like to start off by asking Claudio, are there measures that owners could implement to make sure that things are easier for the members of the project co-teams?
Sure. I just noticed that Shawn's like getting up on his seat, wanting to know what I'm going to say. But yeah, the challenge is, with the market trying to, achieve competitiveness and, bringing substantial completion dates more aggressive. That puts a real challenge on the completion of the project, and as Louise said, sometimes there's going to be challenges with startup. Startup could unfold because even though you do the best job you can at commissioning a building, inevitably there's no load on that building. So it's only when the patients or the staff or the lawyers, depending on what infrastructure you're talking about, as soon as you start introducing a load to the building, do you really get to put the buildings through its testing procedures and through its paces? And so I think there's always a little bit of challenge with buildings when they're brand new. It often causes issues between the developer, the operator, and the design builder. You get a bit of finger pointing. So the one thing that I think that could be done maybe a little bit differently is the bedding in period, which is kind of a period that allows for a fine tuning of a building, right out of the gate. I think if that period was lengthened a bit, especially in northern climates where you're going to have a full 4 seasons and a difference between a summer and a spring and a winter, And it's important to allow the building to be fine-tuned and put through its paces over the course of a full year instead of like a 3-month bedding in process where the penalties are somewhat relaxed for that period. I'm not suggesting that penalties are eliminated, but certainly the penalties could be decreased in order to reflect the fact that we need to do some fine-tuning after the occupants get into the building.
Yeah, thanks, Claudio. And I think that one of the other topics that we've talked about as well has been not moving to substantial completion unless the facility is substantially complete. And that, I think, is a real lesson that we've learned, and we understand the pressure to achieve substantial completion by the scheduled substantial completion date, and that's an important objective for government. Governments like to tout its record of on time and on budget delivery, and it's an important objective for us. No one's interested, with all due respect to my dear friends, the lenders, no one's interested in paying them interest, right? We'd rather keep that money in the project and going towards delivering the project. So no one's, LDs don't do anyone any favors. So it's not a question of waiting until every last door handle is tightened, but it's understanding what you're entering into if you do move to substantial completion with a substantial amount of deferred works that aren't contemplated in the project agreement, and so that we therefore haven't had an opportunity to sort of contract around upfront. One, I think, interesting innovation that you guys have introduced is the 3-month phase completion for IT infrastructure, and we'll get into that. We'll get into the question of IT later on. But that idea of actually having a client-driven stress testing of the building, in addition to regular commissioning, is, I think, a really probably a helpful step in the right direction.
Maybe I'll add just before we move on. I'm not against adjusting the bedding in period, and I think what we've done there with IT is in that direction. I look to Service Co and the Project Co to give us some innovative options on that, because we want to make sure that the risk is transferred. And that there are clauses in there to keep that healthy tension, to make sure you're keeping it on time and you are working towards getting that optimum performance level.
And maybe just add on as another option to consider, even beyond extending the bedding in period, maybe some relaxation, not even necessarily of deductions, but even in the response and rectification times, because what we find in that initial period after, when you're transitioning from construction to operation, there's all this warranty work going on. There's deficiencies having to deal with the staff that's available to respond to it. The contractors moved off site. The operators there, they have a staff that's really sized to deal with issues through a normal phase of the project, not that really difficult, intensive phase right after construction. So if there was even some leniency on the response and rectification times, you might get it might be more in line with the fact that the project isn't complete. It's still moving from substantial to final completion.
Yeah, I think I just have to say, if I could be convinced that by being more lenient, it would give us a better result, I would go there, but I'm not quite convinced. And I think some of our owners and our clients, look to make sure those tools are in place. And in fact, we're constantly trying to battle back and push back to make those reasonable. So it's all about, I think, the industry, demonstrating to us that, notwithstanding the fact that maybe we can make those changes, it has to demonstrate that it's going to give us the result that we're all looking for.
I could argue there'd be value, though, because if those changes aren't made, you're going to have to staff that period of time, be it a month, 2 months, 3 months immediately after substantial, with far more staffing than you would otherwise, and the cost of these projects are going to go up once people realize that the risk of deductions and issues arising immediately after substantial. And as we talked to, I think, Louise before the session, one of the big issues that we see is when things go wrong right after substantial completion, the relationships break down. When the relationships break down, it's really hard to bring it back on track. If everyone kind of realized that this phase after substantial was really a transition phase as well, the whole relationship might get off on a better foot.
Well, it's interesting because when you look at the facilities management industry, essentially, which has these transitions from service provider to service provider, One of the things that has been introduced in the last number of years is actually a requirement for an implementation period, which is the continuity of the transition period post-implementation, to recognize exactly what you're talking about, Darrell, and the recognition that you're going to need extra staff to actually get things done and get things going. So, those are all really interesting tools. I mean, what we're hearing is that whole period of handover can definitely impact the overall relationship, and you want to have enough pressure to get the work done, but not so much that it's creating disruption. Can you, Shawn and Darrell, just talk about deficiencies and warranty management? Just continue on that stream of thought. Are there any thoughts on how that could be better managed? Because again, that's one of the areas that causes a lot of concern.
Maybe I'll just jump in first, and Darrell, you have some thoughts on this. We've chatted about this a little bit before. There's a panel, I think, just down the hall. An operations panel. Don't go there. This is the better one. But I think it's called Back from the Brink. And I've been involved. You asked about our experience in that. I've been in a few of those scenarios. I don't think I need to talk about those. But I would like to maybe just start off by saying there's been some really good news stories out there in this. And it's amazing to me, and I've chatted with some of the folks in the industry, that it's amazing that in some of these scenarios, we've had some major things that are going on right now, and some buildings that are being fixed without any penalties, any deductions, with all due respect, lawyers being involved, and it's working well. So I think that's something we need to explore. Why does it work really well sometimes and sometimes it doesn't? I'm clearly an advocate, and maybe I'm stating the obvious here, but and even this touches on our last conversation, is that if there's quality at the construction phase, if the commissioning is done right and the handover and training is done right, we shouldn't need to tinker with making this better in the operations phase. Albeit there are challenges and within the project agreement that maybe could be fixed because they're not customized for the project agreement, and they're more designed for the operations phase. They're more designed for the construction phase.
Yeah, and this discussion probably leads into, I think, one of our next topics was dealing with the interface agreement, which is more a consortium issue. So at the level of Progeco and the authority, one of the trends we've seen is the reduction of security from the contractor leading into the post-substantial completion phase. And one thing we've had some discussions about is similar to what some of the procuring authorities have with minor deficiencies, where they have a holdback, is maybe having a warranty holdback that might help drive the right behavior post substantial completion. And if the authority retains that, you'd have competitive, you'd have equal sort of bidding because it'd be the same holdback for all the parties bidding on the deal. And that might, achieve the authority's objective of making sure the work gets done and the appropriate parties held to complete that in a timely manner.
I think if there's a mechanism we can put in the PA that allows the consortium to sort things out better and faster, we were in favor of that. That way we don't have to get involved. And I'm really encouraged the fact that we're having these conversations now. There's some good ideas out there. And I'm hearing divergent views on some of the ideas too, so we need to talk them through a bit more, whether it's some kind of security in the warranty phase or a regime within the warranty phase, similar, I think, Darrell, you mentioned this, similar to the minor deficiency regime, maybe a warranty regime, but a tool within the PA that speaks to that phase. And really what we're finding now is that the minor deficiencies, I think we get better at that. We have a new regime there, minor deficiencies. We're all curious to see how that works, I think, and Mackenzie Vaughn's the first one. We're curious to see how that works. And then, from that, how can we look at what we're seeing now as post-substantial warranty issues? And we're pretty slow to react and use some of the mechanisms in the PA. Maybe they're not best designed for us to tackle them. And again, I have to say this, I'd rather not even have to use any of those mechanisms if it's all done right up front.
Yeah, and back up what Shawn said. I mean, I think, Claudia, you'll admit that, Paul. I mean, 90% of the projects are going exceptionally well. And there's just a few projects that, issues arise, but they can be significant. And I agree, IO and the customer are working hard to resolve those and come up with a solution that works for everybody.
Shawn, I just don't know that all the issues are necessarily like black and white and that are really responsibility of the different team members within Progeco. because I think to some degree there could be a compliance issue or a design intention issue. There could be just technology integration with all the technologies that are being introduced onto P3s now. So there could be reasons why the authority should be kept in the loop on that, and the warranty reserve is something that we think keeps the authority at the table as well.
So Paul, your thoughts on that, and whether or not essentially the owner should get involved in the interface agreements and start putting in place these types of measures?
Yeah, well, it's really important that everyone have the correct incentives as you're entering into the operating period to make sure that the building is complete and functioning in the way it was supposed to. The design builder, that's in the design builder's interest as well. They want to get off site. They're anxious to move on to the next job as well, and it's expensive for them to have to keep bringing people back. It's one of the things that bugs them the most about is to have to send crews back to the job site to do that. So, but I think that the issue that Claudia was raising is the issue of complexity, right? And for the most part, we've done a reasonable job, we collectively, the industry, of figuring out how to deal with the simple things. And we thought about this a lot, like 10 years ago when we were putting these arrangements together in the first place. And for the most part, they work on the pretty simple things. Just the really interesting stuff isn't simple, right? The really interesting stuff is really complex, and it's partly because the buildings the facilities are getting more and more complex, right? And it's partly that things only really rise to the U level when it's a complicated issue, and there's disputes about like who's at fault and so on. And I do think we need to do a better job of streamlining that process, that sort of and distinguishing a little bit between who's responsible to fix the issue, right, and who's responsible to pay for it. And though there's, I think, a tendency to, no one wants to go out of pocket on these things, and I think, the default. Back at the default that we set up in most of our interface agreements was because we wanted to stop the bleeding, is the metaphor we always use. You want to stop the bleeding of deductions, and so we just said, well, you, the service provider, Claudia, you're on site, your staff, so the default rule is you guys deal with it. You send a notice to the design builder. If the design builder doesn't deal with it immediately, then you deal with it, and then they'll pay you. They'll pay you back. And
if only everything could be that easy.
Yeah, but then it turns out they sort of accept responsibility for it, but it's not really all their fault. Like maybe it's a bit of you, and maybe it's the client. Maybe the client's just wrong, right? Maybe the clients are imposing deductions on us. We think it happens. I know you don't. And so I think we need to do a better job of and we're certainly working on that on our side, on working out a more efficient mechanism for being able to do that. Take care of the issue as soon as possible and stop deductions accruing, right? And from your side, stop the interruptions to service, right, as soon as possible, and then figure out how to pay for it later, and figure out who's responsible for paying for it later on. But we're still working our way through that latter part.
Yeah, clearly we need a mechanism there.
Yeah, I'd like to move on to talk a little bit about information technology in buildings and how now, as we continue to progress in the electronic age, as buildings and facilities and services are a lot more complex. And we're seeing a lot more of inclusion of information management, technology, communications, even conference room bookings in P3 type arrangements. So I'd be interested in understanding, beginning with Claudio, what's been your biggest challenge in taking on that type of responsibility, the technology risk and the technology services?
Yeah, so for the most part, when P3s were first introduced, right, it's our obligation to maintain the building, the hard asset, because you want to achieve, a better building, better quality, more reliable building with the, the handback provisions, and, I'm fine with that. when you start introducing technologies that are used predominantly by the occupants of the building, so things like the AV systems, the interconnection systems, you heard this morning, the whole network as infrastructure. I mean, if we're beginning to become responsible for that, we're responsible for the productivity and some of the tools that the occupants are actually using. And that becomes a bit of a slippery slope because I think it's maybe a misalignment of goals, because our goal as the lifecycle provider is, you know, we're supposed to maintain that piece of equipment for the duration of its life and then replace it. So my incentive is to keep, you know, to extend equipment life, keep it running as long as possible. That way we can efficiently provide that in our bid. But yet, if the occupants, the owners, the authority inside that building want to replace technology for functional reasons because it makes them more productive. I mean, you saw some of the technologies they were talking about, you know, holographic systems this morning. Yeah, I can't wait till we have to replace that kind of stuff. But like right now, when you go from like 4K TVs to 8K TVs to holographic displays, like, you know, the owner may want that technology replaced in a far more frequent cycle than I would as the operator, when I can make a display screen last 10 years, but if the owner wants it replaced after 5 years because they want the better functionality, there's kind of a misalignment there. And so I think, you know, that's part of the challenges that we face is, you know, are we the entity best suited to mitigate that risk when really there's a bit of a misalignment. So, you know, we can talk about how we can make some monies available. Like I can bring my life cycle monies available, you know, for replacement of technologies. But at some point, if I'm replacing technology every 10th year and the owner wants it replaced every 5th year, I'm going to run out of life cycle monies to offer up to the owner. And so I think that's a bit of a challenge that we need to work through collectively.
Yeah, and I think this is going to be like this is going to be a theme of the panel and probably of, like, you know, of this conference probably every year is allocating risks that we have the ability to manage, and then knowing on the owner side what choices you're making about when you're transferring over risk. You know, when you're transferring over risk, you have to transfer over responsibility as well, right? And I think this is, the IT is where this issue is currently sharpest, because clients get really sold on a particular outcome. Like most clients aren't especially invested in what type of chiller they have, right? They just want a particular kind of air. They just want a particular standard of air quality, right? Yeah. But they're really, really interested in what kind of, you know, what their Wi-Fi network is, how the Wi-Fi network works, and how the communication systems work, and so on. And they get sold by technology providers on a particular sort of set of outcomes. And then the more they try and prescribe those outcomes, the less control we have and the less ability we have. And that's the real challenge. That becomes the real challenge for us.
That prescriptiveness, so, which we're trying to move away from, and you heard discussions this morning about that. We're trying to get our end user clients to move away from being prescriptive. And I think we're making some headway there, but this is one where we have to maybe think of other ways. And maybe, you know, we had a situation with the detention center where the security system just wasn't meeting what they intended it for, and we switched it out. And it was painful, but, you know, it's working out for the best. But one of the solutions may be to have more transparency, maybe answering the question you asked me later, Louise, but more transparency within the bid document so that we can have those flexible discussions as we go forward. And the prescriptiveness thing, you know, Claudia, you mentioned if they want to switch it every 5 years, then maybe that needs to be prescribed. But that's the challenge. That's where I look to the industry to be flexible as well, because you don't want us to be prescriptive maybe on this topic. And like you say, we're going to be talking about this every year as things evolve here.
But prescribing a solution may not lead to the value for money for that particular project. And you're kind of stuck. Like I think about how the P3 industry has really solved this for energy assets. So if you think about the energy guarantees, and IO has a very good energy schedule. There's a gain share and a pain share mechanism, so that if we're not able to produce the energy efficiency that we said we would, we take the pain on that. But if we're able to work together with our client, there's a gain share mechanism where we split 50-50. So we're actually encouraged through that gain share mechanism to bring newer technologies to the table. And that's why I believe it was introduced, is so that, if we have better technologies in 5 or 10 years' time, the idea is that we would want to introduce those technologies into the building to take advantage for both the owner side and our side, that we can take advantage of the cost savings through that incentive, that risk sharing. And so I think on technology, we need to find a way of having a risk and reward scenario. I don't mind taking the risk for that, but there's got to be a reward scenario for us in introducing the holographic technologies into conference rooms.
So just a question for Darrell in terms of capturing the appropriate language in the agreements related to this. There's been introduction of regimes like the system availability regimes, et cetera. Do you feel that the project agreements are properly capturing them? Is there anything that could be done better in terms of?
Well, just on that first one, the systems one, I thought that was actually really useful and innovative by IO when they introduced that. We had, and we saw that in a number of jobs where, you had technology systems and there was a big debate whether, it was actually a failure of a single functional unit or a failure and unavailability of the entire facility. And I think IO, came up with a model that essentially it was somewhere in between. And I think that was probably an appropriate way to deal with the issue. I think that was a good example of, I don't think either side's entirely happy, but I think that's probably where it works out the best. So I think that was a useful solution that they came up with. And that kind of thought and interaction with the private sector, I think, is very good. I think the difficulty with this prescriptive nature and what we've seen is that, so you prescribe sort of the technology you want, or the particular specs for but if you also prescribe the actual contractual terms, and then basically tell us, here's the contract you negotiated, carry this as your sub, and then at the PA level though, you mandate a much higher requirement to meet than the subs taken through the subcontract. You're creating this imbalance between what the private sector can get from the sub, recover from the sub, versus what it's got to grant to the public sector. And some of that risk, I think Paul would probably speak to, and Claudio, I think the private sector can take, but finding the balance of that in the contractual terms is really the difficult piece.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's an essential part of every, it's an essential component of every negotiation is the right to say no, right? And if you've prescribed that we have to use a particular vendor, we don't actually have that right? So that really makes it difficult for us to come up. And I know that, we've tried collectively of a bunch of different approaches. We've done technology via cash allowance back in sort of the Niagara days, right? To the sole source of the MIS on Mackenzie Vaughan. We've done full revenue risk transfer to us on some of the projects, and I think we're still sort of finding our way there. But
I would add that we're still finding our way on 100-year-old technology with elevators in terms of transferring that risk.
That's right.
And we're prescribing which elevator company to use, and maybe it's just an issue of, for us, we need to manage expectations of our end users around that, or try to.
Right.
You put a gazillion points on elevator failures, and it's not going to make the elevators work in some cases. So there's a balancing act there, but ultimately it's about service response on some of this stuff, and I think that an engagement, and that's my view anyway, to make sure that the service response is there, and I think maybe that's where we can steer some of that on technology. And again, I'm talking about some old technology there too. So if we can, make it work with some old technology and see how that, and perfect that, and that's on one of my list of things I want to look at with the industry, and then maybe take what we've learned there to some of the newer technology.
Yeah, and I think the elevators are a great analogy, because they you have the same issue of there being a limited pool of specialist contractors, right? And so at some point we're hostage to a subcontracting industry who doesn't primarily do P3s, right? So they don't normally have to accept the risk transfer that we do, and it's really hard to get them to move.
And I think as an industry, I just got to say this, is that, look, this whole thing is based on risk transfer. That's why we have P3s. That's why we have a conference. And so we need to find a way to make it work. Otherwise, the taxpayers are going to go, well,
what am I paying for? Yeah, exactly.
So we have to find creative ways to keep it there. And that may mean some of the risk is retained with you guys. But I'm all about clarity of that risk. So you know what you need to price, whether you push it down or you retain it.
Right.
I'm going to take a question from the audience since we're dealing with the allocation of private and public sector risks. So how do you think the energy target attainment risk should be split between the design builder and the O&M service providers, given the energy targets are evaluated after substantial completion when the DB has demobilized? So maybe we can ask Claudio to just start that off. And
Well, I mean, first and foremost, it's a team effort, right? Every successful P3 is going to exist because it's a good collaboration, it's a good team effort. It's not like the design builder's going through the design build and construction phase solo. I mean, the engineers are there, the architects are there, we're there. We sit at the table from day one, talking about, the life cycle and operability and energy efficiency of those systems. So, ultimately, the DB hasn't demobilized. I mean, the design builder really has to, together with the team, have to prove that the energy targets are being met. And it's largely a function of the construction issue and, that it's been effectively commissioned and designed. So, and our role is to make sure that we're, with the team, making sure that all those systems are commissioned and that, in that test period that we are operating the equipment the way that what it was intended. So it really is a team effort, but, I would say the DB contractor has a lot to do with the attainment of the energy target at that point.
That's a really good question. I hadn't thought about it from that angle. And I think the root of that question is really are you at the table enough? Because, we sometimes wonder, does the FM service provider have enough of a voice at the table to influence the design for optimal performance? And in this example and other examples.
I think this is going to come down to a question of complexity, right? Back in with really simple buildings, it's primarily a construction issue, and you make sure you turn on the fans when it's you turn on the fans when it's warm outside, right? For these complex buildings now, right, with the building automation systems that can control every fan individually, and so on. The energy model, because the energy pricing is quite rightly part of the evaluation, we're looking to make the building, the designed building that we have, run as efficiently as possible pursuant to the energy model, right? Because we're trying to save as much energy as possible, and that requires a really, really complicated set of operating assumptions and design parameters. And if you get into the operating phase and it turns out that the building is not achieving the single measure, there's one single measure, you start to unpack it, and there are 100 different reasons why that could possibly be the case. And some of them are design issues, and some of them are construction issues, and some of them are operating issues, and some of them are specification issues. Sure. And again, we haven't yet done an amazing job of quickly being able to figure out what's the root cause of that, right? And
I would just add to it, Paul, I mean, this is a perfect example of a true public-private partnership, because in some instances it could also be the authority and the users that are contributing to that as well. I mean, we have facilities with operable windows where, some people just like fresh air in the summer, and so it's primarily a design and construction with some operational input, and they need to be at the table involved in that, but it's a partnership too. The users have to understand what the facility is, designed to accomplish and use it.
Just to move on, and in a conversation with one of our clients in public safety, one of the things we were talking about actually was whether or not you can, once the contracts are operational, recalibrate them. Sit together at year 3, year 5, and adjust like we would do normally in facilities management, the services, the requirements, the payment mechanism, to better reflect the reality. So I'd be interested in hearing from Shawn and from yourselves on whether you think this would be something that should and could be done on P3 arrangements.
My first reaction is it makes me nervous, because I'm a big believer in the model, in the DBFM model, and having the maintenance provider at the table during design and all the benefits that come with that, and holding them accountable. We're really starting to see some success stories on this topic with pain share, gain share, and even some projects that were not doing well. There was a lot of pain share, and they've turned them around. I have a lot of faith in that. There's complications and open windows and things like that, but I've personally been doing this for years, and it's doable, and the technology is so much better now than it used to be with sub-metering and everything else. So it's all very doable. So recalibrating at year 5, there have to be some transparency again, I guess, so that we have a good understanding of some of the costing that was initially put in there if we're gonna rework these.
Yeah.
And then the downside to that is potential gaming of that information, and so how we evaluate that to make sure it's clean, so that in year 5 we're not speaking to economic factors that really were gamed or maybe kind of lowballed or something like that. So I suppose it's doable. I have a lot of faith in the mechanisms the way they work now, but it may be something we have to think about with some of the more advanced technologies.
Yeah, I think it factors into a conversation that has been going on in other panels as well, right, on the flexibility of the DBFM model, right, and that's part of, you know, what this other, like the other boring operations panel talking about the resiliency of the model. Part of that is going to be, 30 years is a really long time, especially for buildings that increasingly are technologically complex and so on, and they have to be adaptable, and, you know, we certainly see that in the transit and transportation sector, right? And it is a challenge, right? So I'm on the bidding side of these jobs, and like, you know, my lenders are bidding into a particular risk profile and scope, and so on. At least they're bidding into that subject to the mechanisms for changes that are embedded in the project agreement. And so I think it's really up to us to do a little bit more work up front and a little bit more thinking about how we prepare for specific kinds of changes that we might want to implement in the future, and then come up with mechanisms for dealing with that. And I know that that you guys in Metrolinx have been looking at those sorts of mechanisms on Finch LRT and some of the other transit projects. Our colleagues in Australia have done a lot of work on that around what they call like the augmentation schedules, which they distinguish from, you know, from the usual type of variations. These are major changes to the risk profile, and we're in the process of implementing a couple of them now under these kinds of procedures, and it lays out just like the whole mechanism exactly. It lays out like what open book means and what transparency means and where you're looking to find these things.
I will add, Louise, there actually is a mechanism in the PAs already to actually do this. I mean, you're actually supposed to meet every year and actually look at functional units, functional areas, weightings, deductions, and I think that's kind of overlooked. And I think it really is a mistake, because we've seen a number of problems, and I think the most common example is you're bidding these projects usually at 30% design development or something in that neighborhood. And when you actually complete those designs, you know, the functional units and functional areas that you identified at 30% change dramatically. So we had one extreme example where at the bid stage, there was like 800 rooms identified, and by the time the facility was built, there were 12,000 rooms. And that was clearly an example where you needed to actually sit down and rework it. And the way the mechanism works in the project agreement is you can rework it as long as the risk profile stays the same. And I do think that the authority in the private sector should meet on a regular basis. If the risk transfer is going to stay the same, they can at least adjust the weightings and stuff, because we have seen things like, you know, where you've got administrative penalties, the facility's running perfectly fine, and the administrative penalties aggregate to a point where you're losing your entire payment. But the facility is running perfectly fine, and all the users see it perfectly fine, but there's issues regarding reports that are being dealt with. Well, maybe you can adjust the deductions on the actual use of the facility side and lower them on the administrative side. So there is a mechanism there, and I just think it should be used.
It's a good point, and I think maybe you're going to say this, but that's a really good point, because I think when I came into this industry, I was a little shocked by how rigid some of these contracts are relative to outsourced facility management. And Louise knows we adjust KPIs and things like that on an annual basis. So it's a good point.
So I'd like to move on, we only have a short amount of time left, related to P3s and existing buildings. So we're seeing a lot more of existing facilities or interfaces with existing buildings. And I'd be interested in understanding what you believe the owner should consider when they're thinking about integrating an existing facility in a P3. And can we start with Paul on this?
Yeah. So, you know, I'm going to sound a little broken record, but transfer risks to us that we can manage, right? So, and that's really the key difference between these brownfield kind of projects and the greenfield ones, is that we're going to have to end up touching and taking responsibility for someone else's work, and that's a scarier thing for us. That's a scarier thing for us to have to do, and possibly, you know, the starting point has to be that it's a risk you already have. Right, you are already the owner of the existing condition of that asset. So you're not losing anything by not transferring it. But so you've got to figure out, like, what am I gaining by, how am I now making like my life as the client better by transferring this risk over?
So I think this is a tremendous opportunity. And we know that a lot of jurisdictions are looking at P3s as applied to existing buildings. We've seen British Columbia look at it. The federal government's looking at it on a project right now. There's a project in Toronto that we're working on. So I think it's an exciting idea. Can you bring more value to the money for the public taxpayer by working on brownfield projects instead of always doing greenfield construction jobs? And I think as long as it's a good balance of risk between the retained public sector risks and what they're going to transfer, I think it could work very effectively. You know, as an operator, I'm willing to stand up. You know, look, I own the risk for a 30-year, you know, in the US, sometimes even 40-year contracts. So halfway through my building, like you could say, I've got a 20-year-old building and I've got the next 20 years of life. So what's the difference if I take on a building at the beginning of the contract and it's at, you know, year 20, year 30 of its life? I've got no problem doing that. I've got no problem taking risk on systems that I have some control over, that I'm going to maintain, because ultimately I'm being hired to maintain this equipment. Where I begin to draw a line is around things that, like structural items, foundational items that really are non-maintainable. I mean, I'm never going to do anything with the structure. The structure is intended to be there for 50, 70 years. And so when project authorities try to push some of their, what we think are just inherent risks of building ownership onto the private sector, I think that's an imbalance that probably needs to be addressed, because I think there's a very cost-effective way that P3s can be brought to the existing building market. But if we're faced to take on existing building risk, like non-maintainable item risk, like structures, like curtain walls, glass panels, things like that, I think it's something that, could add money to a job that, inherently probably shouldn't be there.
Darrell, any comments from you on the contracting portion of existing buildings and whether you need to ring fence any portion of it to get better value?
Well, certainly, I mean, what we've seen in the market, we've seen some combination actually of, in some projects where you've got a greenfield development and then you're taking over an existing one. I think the integration makes a lot of sense. If it's an expansion to a facility, you want to have the whole thing working together. You probably have to ring fence it a little in terms of the issue that Claudia was talking about, which is the defect issue. And I think, to be honest with you, the market's really still trying to sort that out. I mean, we've just seen a few of these projects in the market. We've bid a few of them, and each of the approaches are slightly different. And I don't know that there's a perfect solution for it right now. I think, as Claudia says, taking out the structural makes sense. Then the issue is, if you're doing some retrofitting and refurbishment, how much do you take on, because you're now doing work on parts of the facility that you weren't otherwise touching, and so there might be some risk transfer there. It's a difficult issue, and I think Shawn will probably say we're working through it certainly on at least one project here in Toronto right now, and in other jurisdictions, each of them are sort of treating it a little differently right now, so I don't know that there's a perfect solution to it, but I think you could go Claudia's way, which says anything we maintain, we can sort of take responsibility for. Another way, exclude out structural. I think it's fluid right now, and we haven't come up with the perfect solution yet.
And I think maybe, if I may, just quickly on our McDonald Block project, the one you're referring to, from what I can see is that we're doing everything we can to set that up. We're even doing the disentanglement work ourselves right now, so that we can hand that project over. And as well, the way that contract is set up, all the structural elements, Claudia, you mentioned, are retained by us. So that's one, I think, that's a brownfield project, but it's our intent to hand it over in a very clean state. For me, the challenge, and we could talk about this probably for a little while, but the next challenge for us is, and Claudia's talked about this, is what I'll call a true brownfield, where we have a building and a deferred maintenance situation where we want to take this model and try to really push the limits of it, and can we use this model in an operating building and go floor by floor or something? That'll get way more complicated than what you think it is now. But I think that there's a huge market out there, and if we can find a way to make that work, boy, that might be something that we'd be interested in at IO.
I just look at the have and have not situation that P3s can create. Is if you're fortunate enough to be a hospital authority that's going to get a replacement hospital, that's great, you're doing high fives. But if you're a hospital that isn't going to get a retrofit or a replacement hospital, is there a way of doing a retrofit and bringing some of those principles of P3 and some of that transfer of risk? And, as an operator, I'd be willing to raise my hand and say, sure, we're willing to look at that. Can we repurpose systems that are already in place? As long as the layout of the hospital or the layout of the building can be repurposed, is there a way for a P3 in an existing building to extend life of that building? Can you get another 30 years out of it, and really like useful, reliable 30 years? And, I always think about resetting the clock, right? If we do a significant enough retrofit, I can reset the clock on my cost of operations and cost of energy and cost of life cycle, because I've chosen to replace the systems that are end of life, but I may have chosen to keep systems that, the government, in the last 4 or 5 years may have put significant money into a roof. So maybe I won't replace the roof right away. Maybe I'll wait till year 15 because they've just spent, money on the roof system. So there's ways that we could think that there's a very cost-effective a building program that could be put in place that
to
could
deal
be
with
tested.
that.
Yeah.
We do have another question from the audience that I'm going to direct to Shawn, and then we'll have one other question and close off. So do you think authorities should include exit provisions to limit exit of the design-build JV from the SPV 1 or 2 years after substantial completion as another mechanism to have the design-build joint venture involved during the operations phase?
Well, that's a really good question. I looked at it a moment ago. I thought, well, I hope Louise doesn't ask me that. So, no, only because I don't have a strong opinion on that. I haven't given it a lot of thought, but I like the idea of it. The concept obviously is just to hook them in longer. We sometimes wonder, what is it that's in these drop-down agreements? Can we see the drop-down agreements? I've had people in the industry tell me that we need to be prescriptive and maybe we should manage and prescribe the drop-down agreements. So there's mixed messages out there, but ultimately this is about making sure that the design builder has more skin in the game for a longer period. And I think that could be one of the solutions and we talked about this earlier about how do we make sure that the design builder is there when post-substantial problems come up? And this could be another kind of ingredient in the solution.
Yeah, I think this, unfortunately, this is going to run into the roadblock of the fact that you guys don't have really any equity in your deals anyway, right? So the 10% or whatever, 10, 20% stake that the DBJV has, the value of that equity stake is going to be significantly less than the cost of major issues, and it's not typically sort of one of the things that really intensely motivates them. Generally speaking, they're looking, it's different in the transit sector, but in the building sector, they're looking for a seat at the table kind of level of equity, and that's not enough to really act as a hammer. It is still really important to make sure that the incentives are set up in the right place, but I'm not sure that this one is going to get you any bigger hammer than the sorts of things of like post-completion performance security or some other sorts of mechanisms that are more targeted to how the construction industry actually works in the rest of its life, right? In the because most of what they do is not P3s, right?
So maybe just to close out, as we come to the end, I'd just ask you in a few short words to each address, what enhancements would you introduce to improve the efficiency of the risk transference? So short response, starting with Claudio, moving our way towards Shawn.
Well, what I would suggest is Look, I think the industry's learned a lot from the 15 years or so that we've been at this game. And I think the key is in the last P in the partnership, in making sure that there's more opportunity to be open to changes, I would say, in the project agreement or in the procurement structure, as opposed to maybe some intransigence that's been setting in. So I would just like to make sure that, look, we're trying to bring good ideas to the table, just to make sure that the industry can move forward successfully with real value for money, and want to make sure that those ideas get the real attention on the other
Great,
side of the
so
table.
ability to change and
Yes.
fluidity.
Yeah.
Darrell?
Yeah, I'll just sort of follow on that. I think that's exactly right. I think we've seen so many now in operations, and we realize, particularly on the lawyer side, we think we've drafted these brilliant contracts, but you can't draft something that's going to work perfectly for 30 years. And when you actually see the practical realities of what's happening on the ground, I think what's needed is, outside of the CCM structure, where it's difficult to have a full dialogue, we need really, I think, the private and public sector to get together, listen to each other on lessons learned, listen to each of their requirements and goals, the risk transfers needed, and have that dialogue and help improve the overall model.
Paul?
Yeah, I'd echo those statements. I think the third P is really the crucial part of it, and that applies on our side as well, right? So we've got still a lot of work to do on implementing the lessons that we've learned over the course of 50 years. So I'm going to have to, be nice to Darrell a little bit more, and not Claudia though. But we're always nice to you guys. That's what we have Angela for. Yeah. So it's not just like IO and clients and fixing the project agreement. It's also us getting our own house in order a little bit and making sure that we learn the lessons that we've driven.
Excellent. Shawn, to close off?
I'm a big advocate of us trying to make sure that the risk is clear so that you know what you're bidding on. And we pride ourselves at IO on our continuous improvement process. But I think Aaron said it this morning, we tend to maybe drink our own Kool-Aid, and we need to listen more, and that's part of what I'm hearing here. I've learned a lot just with this panel and in preparing for this panel. So I think there are some ideas out there that we need to bring forward, in addition to making the risk transference clear in the bids.
Great. Well, thank you very much for taking the time and walking us through these different topics related to risks. So please join me in congratulating the team. And thank you for your time. Thank you.